As the world stepped into the dawn of the 18th century, the Americas were already transformed by more than 200 years of
Empires stretched across continents, trade routes crossed the oceans, and powerful nations fought for wealth and influence in distant lands. Yet the new century would become a defining moment, a period when empires expanded, collided, and reshaped the future of the Western Hemisphere.
The 18th century did not begin quietly. Europe was a continent of ambition, rivalry, and restless hunger for power. Kings ruled with confidence, monarchies grew wealthier, and colonial possessions became the lifeblood of global economies. The Americas, rich in land, resources, and strategic importance, had become the center stage for imperial dreams. Spain entered the century as the largest colonial empire in the world. From Mexico to Peru, from the Caribbean islands to the vast territories of South America, Spanish control stretched thousands of miles. Silver mines fueled the Spanish treasury, Catholic missions spread across indigenous lands, and Spanish administrators governed cities built atop ancient civilizations. But beneath the surface, Spain's empire was weakening. Corruption grew. Indigenous populations resisted. Trade slowed. And the once mighty Spanish crown began to feel the weight of its vast and overstretched dominion. Across the Atlantic, another power was rising. Britain entered the 18th century determined to shape the world through commerce, industry, and military strength. British colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America grew steadily, attracting settlers, merchants, farmers, and religious communities seeking new lives. These colonies developed strong economies, social structures, and political identities that would later transform the world. Britain understood that the Americas were not just land, they were opportunity, wealth, and a gateway to global supremacy. Meanwhile, France held enormous influence across North America. From Quebec to Louisiana, French explorers mapped rivers, traded with indigenous nations, and built alliances with native tribes. The French Empire was built not only through settlement but through diplomacy, cooperation, and trade networks that connected indigenous societies with French economic interests. Though smaller in population than Britain's colonies, the French territories covered vast spaces and would soon become the center of deadly conflict. To the south, Portugal controlled Brazil, a colony that produced sugar, gold, and resources that enriched Lisbon. Plantations spread across the coast, worked by enslaved Africans transported through the brutal transatlantic slave trade. Brazil grew into a powerful economic engine, shaping the future of South America through its production, trade, and culture. Across the Caribbean, small islands became battlegrounds for wealth. Sugar plantations exploded in profit as European demand soared. The Caribbean was the heart of the slave economy, a place where human suffering, forced labor, and unimaginable cruelty powered the fortunes of European elites. The islands were not just tropical colonies. They were global jewels, fought over fiercely by Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Indigenous nations across the Americas entered the century facing enormous pressure. 2 centuries of disease, displacement, and war had changed their world forever. Yet they were not defeated. Many tribes adapted, formed alliances, fought back, and carved spaces of resistance and survival. The 18th century would see indigenous diplomacy rise to new levels, as tribes formed partnerships with European powers, shaped trade, and influenced the course of wars. While Europe pushed outward across oceans, Africa endured one of the darkest chapters in human history. The transatlantic slave trade reached its peak in the 18th century. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes, chained in ships, and sold into slavery in the Americas. Their labor built empires. Their suffering enriched nations. Their forced presence reshaped the cultural and demographic landscape of the Western Hemisphere. The entire colonial system depended on their exploitation. Inside Europe itself, new ideas began to stir. The Enlightenment spread across intellectual circles, challenging old beliefs about power, religion, and human rights. Thinkers argued for liberty, equality, and reason, ideas that would soon ignite revolutions across continents. But at the beginning of the century, these revolutionary ideas were seeds not yet grown, whispers not yet voices. The economic engine of the time was mercantilism. European empires believed their wealth depended on controlling trade and resources. Colonies were designed to enrich the mother country. Gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, furs, and spices flowed from the Americas into European ports. In return, Europe shipped manufactured goods, weapons, and tools to its colonies. Ships crossed the Atlantic constantly, creating a triangle of commerce that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a cycle of profit and suffering. This system intensified competition between empires. The 18th century became a period of constant conflict. Wars fought not only in Europe, but across the American continent. Each empire sought to expand its territory, eliminate rivals, and gain control of trade routes. These battles shaped the borders, cultures, and political landscapes that exist today. At the same time, colonial societies grew more complex. In the Spanish colonies, a strict caste system developed, separating people by race, class, and heritage. Creoles, mestizos, indigenous people, and Africans navigated a world built on inequality. In the British colonies, tensions grew between settlers and the crown, foreshadowing future rebellion. In French territories, alliances with native tribes strengthened both trade and military power. As the 18th century progressed, the balance of power shifted. Spain struggled to maintain its empire. France faced growing rivalry with Britain. Britain gained economic strength and global influence. Indigenous nations faced new pressures as European expansion intensified. Enslaved people resisted, rebelled, and preserved their cultures despite unimaginable oppression. And in the background, revolutionary ideas simmered beneath the surface, waiting to ignite. The century began with empires rising, competing, and reshaping the Americas. But it would end with nations emerging, revolutions erupting, and the entire Western Hemisphere transformed forever. The forces set in motion at the dawn of the 18th century would shape the battles, upheavals, and independence movements still to come. The world had entered a century of ambition, conflict, and dramatic change, a century that would leave the Americas forever altered. As the 18th century unfolded, Spain entered the new era still holding the largest colonial empire in the Western Hemisphere, territory that stretched from the deserts of northern Mexico to the mountains of Peru, from the trading ports of the Caribbean to the heart of South America. For more than 2 centuries, Spanish rule had shaped the language, culture, religion, and identity of millions. But beneath the surface, the empire was beginning to crack. The 18th century would expose its weaknesses, challenge its authority, and reveal how fragile its golden empire had become. When the century began, the Spanish crown controlled vast lands, but its power was not as strong as it once appeared. The empire was suffering from internal decay, bureaucratic corruption, economic stagnation, population decline, and inefficient governance. Spanish administrators, often appointed from Europe and poorly informed about American realities, struggled to control distant provinces. Local elites gained influence. Wealth circulated among a small class instead of strengthening the empire as a whole. The machinery of empire was rusting. At the same time, Spain's economy depended heavily on silver from mines in Mexico and Peru. For decades, these mines had fueled the crown's treasury, allowing Spain to finance wars, maintain armies, and sustain royal ambitions. But by the 18th century, production was slowing. Mines were exhausted. Indigenous and African laborers resisted harsh working conditions. And global markets shifted, reducing the value of silver. Without this lifeline, Spain began to lose financial control, weakening its grip on its colonies. Spain also faced challenges from within its colonial society. A complex social hierarchy known as the caste system divided people by race, heritage, and birthplace. At the top stood the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe who held the most powerful positions. Below them were the Criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas, who resented their inferior status despite being wealthy and influential. Beneath them were mestizos, indigenous peoples, Africans, and mixed communities, many of whom suffered discrimination and limited rights. This rigid hierarchy created resentment that grew year by year. Criollos began to see themselves not as Spaniards, but as something different, Americans with a unique identity and growing dissatisfaction. Indigenous communities, still recovering from centuries of disease and conquest, resisted exploitation. Enslaved Africans rebelled wherever they found opportunity, challenging Spanish authority even at great personal risk. The empire's foundations were cracking from the inside. As if these internal tensions were not enough, Spain also faced new threats from rival empires. Britain expanded aggressively across the Caribbean and North America. France strengthened its alliances with native tribes and built trading posts deep inside the continent. Portugal dominated Brazil and expanded inland. The Caribbean became a battleground for sugar, trade, and naval supremacy. Spain's monopoly on American wealth was disappearing. In response to these growing pressures, Spain attempted to reform itself. The Bourbon monarchy, new rulers from France, who took the Spanish throne, introduced sweeping changes known as the Bourbon reforms. Their goal was simple: strengthen royal authority, increase revenue, and modernize the empire. But the effects were far more complicated. The Bourbon reforms changed everything. Spain reorganized its colonial governments, replacing older systems with new viceroyalties and centralized administrations. Trade restrictions were loosened to increase profit. Taxes were raised. Local militias were formed. New officials were sent from Europe to enforce Spanish control and limit Criollo influence. The Catholic Church, long powerful in the colonies, saw its authority challenged as the crown sought to control missions and religious institutions. Some reforms strengthened Spain temporarily. Others created new tensions. Criollos, already frustrated by their political exclusion, now saw European-born officials taking even more power. Indigenous communities faced heavier taxes and stricter regulation. Free people of color experienced new limitations. The Bourbon reforms tightened Spain's grip on paper, but loosened it in reality, because resentment grew deeper. Across the Americas, people felt the pressure. In New Spain, modern-day Mexico, local merchants clashed with Spanish authorities over trade policies. In the Andes, indigenous groups resisted increased taxation and labor demands. In the Caribbean, Spain struggled to maintain control of its islands, while rival empires challenged its power. And throughout the empire, whispers of discontent began to spread. Spain also struggled with communication. Orders took months to travel across the ocean. By the time a royal decree reached the Americas, local conditions had often changed. Colonial governors acted independently, often prioritizing their own interests over the crown's. Corruption flourished. Smuggling became common, especially in the Caribbean, where British, Dutch, and French merchants traded illegally with Spanish colonies. Spain's attempt to control commerce crumbled against a wave of profitable black markets. Military weakness added to Spain's growing troubles. The empire relied on outdated ships, poorly trained soldiers, and scattered forts that could not defend the empire against modern European navies. British privateers raided Spanish ports. French ships penetrated Caribbean waters. Indigenous nations in frontier regions resisted Spanish expansion. Spain's imperial pride remained, but its military power faded. Yet even in decline, Spain remained deeply embedded in the culture of the Americas. Catholicism shaped daily life. Spanish language unified diverse regions. Architecture, music, and local traditions blended European influence with indigenous and African heritage. Despite political weakness, Spain left a cultural legacy that would endure long after its empire faded. By the middle of the 18th century, the Americas were changing. The old Spanish order faced increasing challenges, not only from outside forces, but from the very people who lived within its empire. Criollos gained wealth and confidence. Indigenous rebellions along the Andes reminded Spain that its rule was never absolute. Enslaved Africans resisted exploitation, influencing cultures and forging communities of survival and resistance. The empire was alive but unstable. As the century progressed, global tensions erupted into war. The 7 Years' War reshaped borders and exposed Spain's inability to keep pace with the rising power of Britain. Spain lost territories, alliances shifted, and the balance of power in the Americas changed forever. The empire that once seemed eternal now stood vulnerable. As Spain entered the later decades of the 18th century, change was inevitable. The forces that weakened the empire, economic strain, social inequality, indigenous resistance, global rivalry, and internal reform, were becoming impossible to contain. Spain still controlled vast lands, but its power no longer reached as deeply or decisively into the lives of its subjects. The 18th century began with Spain as the dominant force in the Americas. But by its end, the empire was fragile, divided, and on the edge of a series of revolutions that would break it apart forever. As the 18th century moved forward, one empire began rising above all others, reshaping the destiny of the Americas and eventually the world. Britain entered the century with ambition, confidence, and a hunger for global influence. While Spain struggled to maintain its fading empire and France navigated uncertainty, Britain pushed forward with a clear mission: expand its colonies, dominate trade, and become the supreme power of the Atlantic world. Along the eastern coastline of North America, Britain's 13 colonies grew rapidly. What began as small settlements of farmers, merchants, and religious communities evolved into vibrant societies with thriving economies. Towns like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston flourished as centers of commerce and culture. The population surged as immigrants from Europe sought new lives, bringing skills, ideas, and dreams of opportunity. Unlike the rigid caste structure in Spanish America, British colonies allowed social mobility, giving many people hope for a better future. At the heart of Britain's success was its mastery of trade. British ships filled the Atlantic, carrying goods across continents. Timber, furs, tobacco, fish, sugar, and countless other products flowed into British ports. In return, the colonies received manufactured goods, tools, textiles, and luxury items. This booming exchange created wealth on both sides of the ocean, strengthening Britain's economy and weaving its colonies tightly into its commercial network. But trade was not simply business, it was strategy. Britain understood that controlling the seas meant controlling the world. The Royal Navy expanded dramatically, building fleets capable of defeating rivals and protecting overseas interests. While Spain's ships aged and France's resources stretched thin, Britain's navy became unstoppable. It patrolled the coastlines, guarded shipping routes, and ensured that British merchants could operate with security and confidence. In the Caribbean, Britain recognized the immense value of sugar commodity that generated enormous wealth. Sugar plantations in Barbados, Jamaica, and other islands became some of the richest properties in the empire. Yet behind this wealth was immense suffering. The brutal plantation system depended on enslaved Africans, who were forced to work under inhuman conditions. Their labor produced the profits that enriched British merchants and fueled economic expansion. The Caribbean became both a symbol of British prosperity and a reminder of the cruelty embedded in colonial systems. Meanwhile, Britain expanded inland across North America. Frontiers pushed westward as settlers moved beyond the coastal colonies, seeking land and opportunity. This expansion brought them into contact and conflict with indigenous nations. Tribes who had lived on these lands for centuries resisted as settlers encroached on their territories. Yet Britain often viewed indigenous nations through the lens of diplomacy and war, forming alliances when useful and breaking them when convenient. These shifting relationships shaped the balance of power in North America. Britain's greatest rival during this period was France. The French controlled vast territory, stretching from Canada down the Mississippi River to Louisiana. These lands were sparsely populated, but strategically vital. As British settlers expanded westward, the two empires collided over control of trade routes, rivers, and indigenous alliances. The tension grew year by year, setting the stage for a conflict that would change the map of North America forever. But even as Britain prepared for confrontation abroad, tensions were growing within its own colonies. The 13 colonies became increasingly confident and independent. They established local governments, built universities, printed newspapers, and developed a strong sense of identity. Many settlers began to see themselves as distinct from Britain, still loyal to the crown, but proud of their own culture, their own achievements, and their own way of life. Yet the relationship was complicated. Britain viewed its colonies as vital pieces of its global empire, expected to supply resources, expand trade, and enrich the crown. Colonists, however, increasingly resisted British control, especially when new taxes or restrictions threatened their autonomy. The seeds of future rebellion were quietly being planted, even if the flames had not yet ignited. By the middle of the 18th century, Britain's economic and military power reached new heights. Its global empire stretched across North America, the Caribbean, Asia, and Africa. British ports bustled with trade. British ships ruled the seas. British cities became centers of finance and innovation. At home, the Industrial Revolution began taking shape, providing technological advances that would further strengthen the empire in the decades ahead. Yet Britain's rising dominance made conflict inevitable. The more it expanded, the more it collided with other empires fighting to protect their own interests. French traders, Spanish officials, indigenous nations, enslaved communities, and even British colonists all felt the pressure of Britain's growing power. And soon, the world would be thrown into a massive war of 7 years. War that would bring the rivalry between Britain and France to a decisive climax. By the end of this chapter, Britain stood on the edge of becoming the world's most powerful empire. But the cost of expansion would be great, and the consequences would reach far beyond the British crown. The empire's rise set into motion events that would reshape not only the Americas but the entire global order. As the 18th century unfolded, the French Empire in North America stood vast, elegant, and fragile. Unlike the British colonies crowded with settlers and bustling with commercial towns, France's territories were defined by immense geography and delicate alliances. From the frosted forests of Canada to the humid bayous of Louisiana, France controlled a massive crescent of land stretching across the continent. But this empire, impressive in size, was increasingly vulnerable to the forces rising around it. France's presence in North America began with trade rather than settlement. French explorers mapped rivers, forged paths through wilderness, and built forts that served as both military posts and trading centers. The economy revolved around the fur trade and enterprise, built on relationships with indigenous nations. For France, diplomacy was as important as soldiers. They understood that their empire could not survive without cooperation, respect, and negotiation with tribes who controlled the land. In the Great Lakes region and along the Mississippi River, French traders lived alongside indigenous communities, learning their languages, customs, and political structures. Marriages between French men and indigenous women created powerful alliances and mixed communities that strengthened both cultures. This blending, rare among European empires, allowed France to extend its influence deep into the continent. But the French Empire was small in population. By the mid-18th century, New France had only a fraction of the settlers found in the British colonies. While millions lived under British rule along the Atlantic coast, France struggled to attract even tens of thousands. Harsh winters, strict regulations, and limited economic opportunities discouraged migration. This imbalance would become a decisive weakness as British settlers pushed westward. France's greatest strength, its alliances with indigenous nations, also became the heart of its struggle. These alliances were built on mutual respect and cooperation, but they required constant attention and trust. As British traders entered indigenous territories, offering goods and weapons at lower prices, many tribes faced difficult choices. The arrival of British settlers threatened their lands more than the French ever had. France needed to keep these alliances strong, but pressures grew as indigenous nations tried to navigate a world where empires competed for their loyalty. Meanwhile, French territory in Louisiana faced its own challenges. The region was rich in land, but poor in population. The vast Mississippi Valley offered fertile soil and access to important waterways. Yet few French farmers were willing to settle there. Slavery powered the plantations that did exist, especially around New Orleans. But the economy remained underdeveloped compared to British colonies on the Atlantic coast or Caribbean sugar islands. By the mid-18th century, France found itself surrounded. British colonies expanded relentlessly. Settlers crossed the Appalachian Mountains, entered the Ohio River Valley, and began establishing farms and trading posts on land France claimed as its own. Indigenous nations protested, but their warnings went ignored by settlers hungry for land. Conflict grew inevitable. To defend their territory, France constructed a line of forts, stretching from Canada to Louisiana. These forts served as symbols of French presence, but many were isolated and difficult to supply. Soldiers stationed there lived in harsh conditions, waiting for orders that often arrived months too late. The French crown struggled to maintain the vast network efficiently, especially as war approached. France's European situation made matters worse. Costly conflicts drained the treasury, and rivalries with Britain stretched beyond North America to Africa, India, and the Caribbean. The French government could not afford to invest heavily in a distant colony when wars consumed resources at home. While British merchants, settlers, and soldiers poured into North America, France had to defend its territory with limited manpower and supplies. As French influence weakened, tensions erupted into open conflict. Skirmishes between French forces, indigenous allies, and British settlers turned violent. The Ohio Valley became a battleground as France tried desperately to hold the frontier. Diplomatic efforts failed. The fragile balance of power collapsed. And soon the conflict expanded into the 7 Years' War, a global struggle that would decide the fate of empires. In the early stages of the war, France fought fiercely. Indigenous allies provided strategic advantages, guiding French forces through forests and terrain unfamiliar to British troops. French commanders used guerrilla tactics, striking quickly and disappearing into wilderness. For a moment, it appeared that France could hold its ground, but the tide shifted as Britain invested enormous resources into the war. Reinforcements arrived from Europe, naval power cut off French supply lines, and British commanders targeted key French cities. The fall of Quebec in 1759 dealt a decisive blow. 1 year later, Montreal surrendered, and France's dream of a North American empire collapsed. By the end of the war, the French presence in Canada was gone. Lands were ceded to Britain, reshaping the map of the continent. France kept control of Caribbean islands, like Guadeloupe and Martinique, valuable for sugar, but the loss of Canada marked the end of French power in North America. Louisiana was handed to Spain as compensation, further shrinking France's role in the Western Hemisphere. The fall of the French Empire sent shockwaves across indigenous nations. Tribes that had relied on French diplomacy now faced an expanding British power that cared little for indigenous sovereignty. Many indigenous communities felt abandoned, their futures endangered by shifting imperial borders they did not choose. For France, the loss of North America became a painful reminder of the cost of underestimating British ambition. For Britain, victory brought new lands but also new tensions that would later spark an American Revolution. And for the Americas, the fall of French territory marked a turning point that reshaped political, cultural, and social landscapes for centuries to come. The French Empire entered the 18th century with vast ambition. It left the century divided, diminished, and forever transformed. As the 18th century unfolded, the Caribbean became one of the most valuable and fiercely contested regions in the world. Small islands, once overlooked by European explorers, transformed into economic engines that fueled empires. But this wealth came with unimaginable human suffering. Sugar-sweet, profitable, and addictive became the center of a brutal system built on the forced labor of millions of enslaved Africans. The Caribbean was not merely a place of tropical beauty. It was the heart of a global struggle for wealth, dominance, and power. Sugar was the fuel that drove the Caribbean economy. European demand for the commodity exploded during the 18th century, turning islands like Jamaica, Saint Domingue, Barbados, Cuba, and Martinique into agricultural powerhouses. Plantations stretched across the land, consuming forests, reshaping landscapes, and creating societies entirely centered on sugar production. The profits were staggering. A single successful plantation could make its owner wealthier than most European nobles. Sugar was often called white gold, and every empire wanted a piece of it. But behind this wealth was a system of unimaginable cruelty. The plantation economy depended almost entirely on enslaved Africans, who were captured, sold, and shipped across the Atlantic in horrific conditions. The Middle Passage, one of history's darkest chapters, saw millions transported in chains, packed tightly in ships where disease, starvation, and violence claimed countless lives. Those who survived the journey arrived in a world where freedom was impossible, and survival meant enduring relentless labor. On the plantations, enslaved workers faced brutal conditions. They worked from sunrise to sunset, cutting cane with machetes under harsh tropical heat. Overseers used whips and torture to enforce obedience. Nights offered no rest. Many enslaved people tended boilers, mills, and furnaces that processed sugar late into the night. Diseases spread rapidly. Lifespans were heartbreakingly short. Plantation owners relied on a constant flow of new enslaved Africans to maintain their workforce. Despite this brutality, enslaved people preserved their humanity, culture, and spirit. They formed communities, created music, practiced ancestral traditions, and resisted whenever possible. Rebellions erupted across the Caribbean, small acts of defiance, escapes to maroon settlements, and large uprisings that shook entire colonies. Their resistance became a powerful force that challenged the colonial order and shaped Caribbean history forever. Meanwhile, European empires battled relentlessly for control of the islands. Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands understood that whoever controlled the Caribbean controlled the wealth of the Atlantic. Naval battles, invasions, and diplomatic negotiations shifted ownership of islands repeatedly. During the War of Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, and other major conflicts, Caribbean islands became bargaining chips, won and lost like pieces on a chessboard. Among all the Caribbean colonies, Saint Domingue stood above the rest. The French-controlled island, today known as Haiti, became the richest colony in the world. Its sugar and coffee exports generated more wealth than entire nations. But its prosperity came at a horrific cost: the harshest slave system in the Americas. Enslaved Africans outnumbered whites by enormous margins, creating a powder keg of tension that would eventually erupt into the Haitian Revolution, the first successful slave revolt in history. In British-held islands, Jamaica became the empire's crown jewel. It produced vast quantities of sugar, attracting merchants, privateers, and fortune-seekers. But it also became a center of resistance, home to the Maroons, escaped enslaved Africans, who built independent communities in the mountains, and fought fiercely to protect their freedom. Spain, though weakened, maintained control over Cuba and Puerto Rico. Cuba's sugar industry grew steadily, and by the end of the century, it would become one of the largest sugar producers in the world. Puerto Rico developed more slowly, but its strategic location made it valuable to Spanish trade and defense. France, Britain, and Spain also built massive fortifications on key islands. Ports like Havana, Port Royal, and Fort Defense became military strongholds, armed with cannons and garrisons ready to defend against naval attack. The Caribbean was one of the most militarized regions in the world, where naval fleets constantly patrolled the seas and pirates roamed in search of treasure. Piracy, though romanticized today, was a violent and dangerous reality. Pirates and privateers, some supported by rival empires, frequented Caribbean waters, attacking ships laden with sugar, gold, and goods. They operated from hidden bases across the islands, challenging imperial authority and influencing trade routes. Yet, despite the constant conflict and exploitation, the Caribbean became a cultural crossroads. Africans, Europeans, and indigenous peoples shaped music, religion, food, and language. African rhythms blended with European instruments to create new musical traditions. Indigenous practices influenced agriculture and medicine. Creole cultures emerged, forming languages and identities that remain vibrant today. By the end of the 18th century, the Caribbean stood at the center of global commerce, imperial rivalry, and human suffering. The profits of sugar enriched Europe and transformed its economies, but the brutality of slavery planted the seeds of resistance, rebellion, and revolution. The Caribbean islands, small in size but enormous in significance, helped shape the destiny of the Americas. The wealth of empires, the rise of global trade, and the future of colonial rule were all tied to the plantations of the Caribbean. And soon, the violence and inequality of this system would ignite the flames of change that would reshape the entire hemisphere. As European empires carved their claims across the Americas in the 18th century, one truth remained constant: the land they desired was already inhabited. Long before Spain, Britain, France, or Portugal arrived, the continent was home to rich civilizations, powerful nations, and deeply rooted cultures that had shaped the land for thousands of years. The 18th century was not simply a story of European expansion, it was a story of indigenous resistance, adaptation, and survival in the face of overwhelming change. By this time, indigenous peoples had already endured 2 centuries of catastrophe. Diseases brought from Europe had devastated populations. Conquest, enslavement, and displacement had torn apart entire communities. Yet they were far from defeated. Across North, Central, and South America, indigenous nations developed new strategies, fighting when necessary, allying when useful, adapting constantly to protect their people and preserve their identity. In North America, powerful confederacies rose to defend their homelands. The Iroquois Confederacy, one of the most sophisticated political systems in the hemisphere, navigated the tensions between Britain and France with skill. They played the two empires against each other, trading furs, negotiating treaties, and ensuring that no single empire dominated their territory. Their diplomacy allowed them to maintain autonomy, even as European influence grew around them. Further south, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw nations adapted by building diplomatic relationships, adopting aspects of European trade, and strengthening their internal governance. They mastered the complex political world of colonial rivalry, using negotiations and alliances to protect their lands. These nations resisted assimilation by preserving their language, culture, and identity while strategically adapting to the new realities of a colonized continent. On the Great Plains, a dramatic transformation unfolded. The arrival of horses brought by the Spanish in earlier centuries revolutionized indigenous life. Tribes such as the Comanche, Lakota, Cheyenne, and Blackfeet became unparalleled horsemen, reshaping the balance of power across the plains. Horses made hunting more efficient, warfare more strategic, and mobility more powerful. The Plains nations built strong cultures that became legendary for their resilience and skill. For a time, they were among the most formidable military powers in North America. In the Southwest, the Pueblo peoples, who had already risen in revolt during the Pueblo Rebellion of 1680, continued to resist Spanish control throughout the 18th century. They preserved their spiritual traditions, agricultural practices, and social structures, despite constant pressure from missionaries and colonial authorities. Their endurance became a symbol of cultural survival. In the Andes, indigenous communities lived under the heavy burden of Spanish rule. Forced labor systems like the Meta exploited their strength to fuel the silver mines of Potosi. But resistance simmered beneath the surface. Late in the century, A massive uprising shook the empire. The Tupac Amaru II Rebellion, led by a man who claimed descent from the last Inca rulers. His rebellion united tens of thousands of indigenous people across Peru and Bolivia, challenging Spanish power in one of the largest uprisings of the colonial era. Though ultimately crushed, it exposed the deep cracks in Spain's rule. Across the Amazon rainforest, indigenous nations maintained control over vast territories that Europeans struggled to penetrate. Smallpox, malaria, and difficult terrain prevented large-scale colonization. Tribes adapted by retreating deeper into the forest, forging alliances with missionaries when necessary, and resisting intrusions with force when threatened. The Amazon remained, in many ways, an indigenous-controlled world throughout the 18th century. In the Caribbean, indigenous populations had suffered catastrophic losses during the first centuries of colonization, but remnants of communities survived in remote regions. Some intermarried with Africans, creating new Afro-indigenous cultures. Others preserved fragments of their traditions, passing stories, agriculture techniques, and spiritual beliefs through generations. No matter the region, resistance took many forms, not always through warfare. Indigenous peoples resisted through language, preserving oral histories when writing was banned. They resisted through ceremony, maintaining traditions outlawed by colonial authorities. They resisted through community, rebuilding their societies after loss. They resisted through adaptation, learning the ways of the invaders, while protecting the heart of their identity. But their struggle grew harder as European expansion accelerated. British settlers pushed deeper into the Ohio Valley. Spanish ranchers expanded across the Southwest. French traders entered the heart of the Great Lakes. Every empire sought alliances but also demanded loyalty. Indigenous nations found themselves navigating a dangerous world where a single treaty could reshape their destiny. Yet indigenous resistance was never simply survival, it shaped the course of empires. European powers depended on alliances with tribes for trade, military support, and territorial control. Battles between France and Britain were often decided by which side could secure indigenous alliances. Even the most powerful empires could not succeed without cooperation from the people who knew the land best. By the end of the 18th century, the relationship between indigenous nations and European powers reached a turning point. Empires began collapsing or shifting. France lost much of its territory. Spain weakened. Britain won wars but created new tensions with its colonies. The seeds of revolution were spreading. And throughout these changes, indigenous nations continued to fight for autonomy, land, and survival. The 18th century was not simply the story of European colonization, it was the story of indigenous endurance. Despite epidemics, warfare, displacement, and oppression, indigenous peoples remained strong, strategic, and deeply rooted in their identities. Their resistance shaped borders, influenced empires, and preserved cultures that still thrive today. The century would end with revolutions that reshaped the Americas. But indigenous nations, through strength, wisdom, and resilience, remained central to the continent's story, emerging from the 18th century, not defeated, but unbroken. As the 18th century reached its height, the Atlantic world was connected by a network of ships, markets, and empires, but at its center was one of the greatest atrocities in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. The Americas, Europe, and Africa were bound together in a triangular system of exploitation that enriched empires and destroyed millions of lives. It was a period when human beings were treated as cargo, sold as property, and forced to build the wealth that would power the rise of the modern world. By the 1700s, the slave trade operated with terrifying efficiency. Ships left European ports loaded with manufactured goods, guns, cloths, alcohol, and tools. They sailed to West Africa, where these goods were exchanged for captives. African kingdoms, facing their own internal conflicts and pressures, participated in the violent network, capturing or selling prisoners of war, traders, or even civilians, to European slave merchants. This cooperation was not voluntary, it was part of a cycle of violence, fueled by demand from the Americas. From the ports of Senegal, Ghana, Benin, Nigeria, and Angola, millions of Africans were forced onto ships bound for the New World. The Middle Passage, their infamous crossing, became a floating nightmare. Captives were shackled together in cramped holds, lying shoulder to shoulder with barely room to breathe. Disease swept through the ships, killing many before they ever reached land. Families were torn apart. Cultures were shattered. Humanity was stripped away as men, women, and children endured terror, starvation, and brutality during the weeks-long voyage. Yet even in the darkest conditions, enslaved Africans resisted. Some refused to eat, rebelling with their bodies. Others fought back physically, attacking crews when opportunities arose. Many leaped into the ocean, choosing death over bondage. Their stories, rarely recorded by those who profited from their suffering, became part of an unspoken legacy of defiance. When ships reached the Americas, the enslaved were sold at markets like livestock. Auctions took place in the Caribbean, Brazil, Spanish America, and the British colonies. Families were separated forever, languages were lost, and identities shattered. Yet the diaspora was born a dispersal of African peoples whose influence would reshape the culture, music, religion, and identity of the entire Western Hemisphere. The Caribbean, with its sugar plantations, absorbed enormous numbers of enslaved Africans. Islands like Jamaica, Barbados, Saint-Domingue, and Martinique consumed lives at a horrifying rate. Plantation owners valued profit over survival. They worked enslaved people to death and simply bought more. Mortality rates soared. Yet enslaved communities formed families, preserved songs, created spiritual practices, and built resistance networks that challenged colonial authority. In Brazil, where Portuguese plantations demanded vast labor, the African population grew so large that Brazil became one of the largest slave societies in world history. Africans brought with them agricultural skills, metalwork, music, and religions that blended with local cultures to form Brazil's unique identity. Quilombo's communities of escaped enslaved people flourished in remote forests and mountains, forging societies built on freedom and resistance. In British North America, enslaved Africans shaped the economy and culture of colonies like Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. Tobacco, rice, indigo, and eventually cotton relied on their labor. Despite harsh laws that banned literacy, gathering, and cultural expression, enslaved people created communities that maintained African traditions in new forms, foodways, folktales, music, and spiritual practices that still survive today. Slavery also powered the economies of Europe. British banks, French shipping companies, Dutch traders, and Portuguese merchants all profited from the triangular trade. European cities like Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, and Lisbon grew rich from the trafficking of human lives. The wealth generated by slavery fueled the industries, technologies, and empires that defined the 18th century. But the brutality of the system sparked moral outrage. Enlightenment thinkers challenged the ethics of slavery. Religious groups condemned its cruelty. Former enslaved people who gained freedom wrote powerful accounts exposing the horrors of bondage. Resistance grew across continents, setting the stage for abolition movements that would emerge in the next century. Perhaps the greatest challenge to the slave system came not from Europe, but from the enslaved themselves. Rebellions erupted across the Caribbean and the Americas, from Maroon Wars in Jamaica to uprisings in Saint-Domingue. The courage of enslaved Africans and their descendants pushed empires to confront the contradictions. In their claims of liberty and humanity, the 18th century was the peak of the transatlantic slave trade, a time when millions were stolen from their homes, forced across oceans, and compelled to build the wealth of empires that denied them freedom. Yet it was also a century of enduring resistance, creativity, and survival. The African diaspora, forged in suffering, emerged as one of the most influential forces in shaping the Americas. By the end of the century, the foundations of the slave trade were beginning to crack. Empires faced revolutions, moral criticism grew louder, and enslaved people themselves ignited movements that would transform the world. The legacy of the 18th century's slave trade is one of unimaginable tragedy, but also of strength, resilience, and the enduring human spirit. As the 18th century reached its boiling point, the tensions that had been building between Europe's great empires finally exploded into a global conflict that would reshape the Americas forever. The 7 Years' War, often called the First True World War, was not just a struggle for European power, it was a battle for the soul of a continent. From the frozen forests of Canada to the tropical waters of the Caribbean, the war determined which empire would dominate North America and set the stage for revolutions still to come. The roots of the conflict ran deep. For decades, Britain and France had competed for land, trade, and alliances across the Atlantic. French territories stretched in a massive arc from Canada down the Mississippi River to Louisiana, while Britain's 13 colonies grew rapidly along the Atlantic coast. As settlers pushed westward, they collided with French traders and indigenous nations who were determined to protect their lands. Every new fort, every trading post, every treaty increased the tension. It was only a matter of time before rivalry turned into war. The spark ignited in the Ohio River Valley, a region claimed by both empires and home to powerful indigenous nations like the Shawnee, Delaware, and Mingo. British settlers and land companies wanted the fertile land for expansion. French soldiers built forts to block British movement and protect their trade. When a young George Washington led a small British force into the region, a violent encounter triggered the chain of events that plunged the world into war. The conflict quickly spread beyond North America. In Europe, Britain and France clashed on land and sea. In India, Africa, and the Caribbean, battles erupted over colonial territory and trade routes. But the most decisive theater where the future of the Americas would be determined was in North America. At the beginning of the war, France held a strong position. French forces, though smaller in number, were highly mobile, experienced, and supported by indigenous allies who understood the terrain. The French built strategic forts like Louisbourg, Frontenac, and Duquesne, creating a defensive network that protected their vast territory. Indigenous warriors fought alongside them, using guerrilla tactics that confused and overwhelmed British troops. Early victories gave France hope that it could maintain control of the continent, but Britain responded with overwhelming force. Determined to crush French power once and for all, Britain poured money, soldiers, and ships into the war effort. The Royal Navy blockaded French ports, cutting off supplies. British generals adjusted their strategies, forming alliances with indigenous nations who had grown wary of France's weakening position. Slowly, the tide began to turn. In 1758, Britain captured Louisbourg, opening the door to Canada. The following year, one of the most famous battles of the war unfolded on the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec. British forces scaled cliffs under cover of darkness, surprising the French army. The battle was brief but decisive. Both commanding generals Wolfe and Montcalm killed, but Britain emerged victorious. With Quebec lost, France's hold on Canada collapsed. The fall of Montreal soon followed. Across the continent, French forts surrendered. Indigenous allies found themselves facing a dangerous new reality, expanding British Empire with little interest in honoring past alliances. The balance of power shifted dramatically. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, Britain targeted France's valuable sugar islands. Battles raged for control of Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Havana, controlled by Spain, France's ally. Though Britain returned some islands after the war, the campaign revealed just how important Caribbean wealth had become in imperial strategy. The global struggle finally ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, a document that redrew the map of the Americas. Britain gained Canada and all French territory east of the Mississippi River. France lost nearly all of its North American empire. Spain received Louisiana but ceded Florida to Britain. Indigenous nations were ignored entirely, their lands traded as if they did not exist. For the European empires, the treaty was a triumph for Britain and a catastrophe for France. But for the indigenous peoples of North America, it marked the beginning of a new and dangerous era. Without France as a counterbalance, Britain expanded aggressively, imposing new policies, restricting trade, and encroaching on indigenous lands. Anger and despair fueled uprisings like Pontiac's Rebellion, a final attempt to push back against British control. For Britain, victory came with enormous costs. The war doubled its national debt. Maintaining new territories required troops and money. British leaders looked to the American colonies for revenue, setting the stage for new taxes, new tensions, and the spark of revolution. For France, the loss of North America shifted its ambitions toward the Caribbean and future revenge against Britain, a revenge that would come when France supported the American Revolution. For Spain, the acquisition of Louisiana brought new challenges, but also new opportunities in the interior of the continent. And for the colonies themselves, the war transformed their identity. British colonists, who had once seen themselves as loyal subjects, gained confidence and military experience. They began to question British authority, especially as new taxes and restrictions were imposed. The unity forged during the war would soon become the unity of a revolution. By the end of the 7 Years' War, the fate of the Americas had changed forever. Britain emerged as the dominant power, France was pushed out, and Spain struggled to defend its remaining territories. The indigenous nations who had shaped the continent's history entered a period of crisis and resistance, and the colonies that had fought alongside Britain would soon turn their weapons toward a new enemy, the empire they had helped to expand. The war ended, but its consequences were only beginning. The stage was set for a chain of events that would ignite revolutions, reshape nations, and redefine the future of the Western Hemisphere. As the 18th century progressed, the Americas transformed into a complex web of economies, castes, and social structures shaped by European ambition, indigenous resilience, and African survival. Colonies that began as fragile outposts had grown into economic engines, producing enormous wealth for empires across the Atlantic. But this wealth rested on deep inequalities, systematic divisions that defined who held power and who lived under its shadow. Across the continent, colonial economies flourished in different ways. In the Spanish Americas, silver remained the foundation of wealth. Mines in Mexico and Peru supplied Europe with precious metals that fueled global trade. But silver was only part of the story. Ranching, farming, textile production, and internal trade networks created sprawling local economies that connected cities, villages, and indigenous communities. Urban centers like Mexico City, Lima, and Bogotá became bustling hubs where merchants, priests, soldiers, indigenous workers, and enslaved Africans lived side by side. In the British colonies, agriculture dominated the economy. Tobacco fields stretched across Virginia and Maryland. Rice plantations thrived in South Carolina and Georgia. Shipping industries boomed in New England, where shipbuilders, merchants, and fishermen supported a thriving Atlantic trade. Cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York grew rapidly, becoming centers of printing, craftsmanship, and political life. A powerful merchant class emerged, shaping commerce and influencing colonial governments. The Caribbean remained the empire's most profitable region. Sugar produced through the brutal labor of enslaved Africans poured wealth into British, French, Spanish, and Dutch treasuries. These small islands, often only a few miles across, generated more revenue than entire continents. But the wealth existed only for the few: plantation owners, European investors, and distant monarchies. For the enslaved, life meant hard labor, suffering, and survival against overwhelming odds. In Brazil, Portugal built a powerful plantation economy based on sugar, gold, and later coffee. Enslaved Africans formed the backbone of the workforce, transforming Brazil into one of the most heavily enslaved societies in the world. Yet enslaved people shaped Brazilian culture, identity, and religion, creating a mix of traditions that survive today. As colonial economies expanded, new social hierarchies arose. In the Spanish world, a rigid caste system defined every person's place in society. At the top were the Peninsueras, Spaniards born in Europe who held the highest offices. Below them were the Criollos, people of full Spanish descent, born in the Americas, wealthy and influential, yet denied the political power held by Below them stood mestizos, people of mixed indigenous and Spanish ancestry, mulattoes, of African and European descent, and zambos, of African and indigenous descent. At the bottom were indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, who faced the harshest restrictions and the fewest rights. This system shaped everything: marriage, education, occupation, and legal status. It created resentment among Criollos, who grew increasingly frustrated at their lack of power despite their economic success. Their anger would eventually erupt into revolution. In the British colonies, class mattered more than race, at least at first. Merchants, plantation owners, artisans, and farmers formed a flexible social structure that allowed some upward mobility. But as enslaved Africans arrived in greater numbers, racial divisions hardened. Laws stripped enslaved people of rights, banned interracial marriage, and treated Africans as property. Even free black people faced discrimination as colonial societies embraced racial hierarchies to justify slavery. In French, Dutch, and Portuguese colonies, similar divisions emerged. Race became a tool of control, separating Europeans from the people whose labor made their wealth possible. Laws were created to maintain order, restrict movement, and suppress rebellion. The colonial world was built on strict lines, visible or invisible, drawn to benefit those at the top. Despite these inequalities, the Americas became a place of cultural fusion. Indigenous, African, and European traditions blended into new identities. Food, music, religion, and language mixed into forms unlike anything seen before. In cities, markets filled with people speaking multiple languages. African drums blended with European instruments. Indigenous agricultural knowledge shaped farming methods. A new world was forming, not purely European, not indigenous, not African, but something uniquely American. Economies grew rapidly, but they also created instability. Land became concentrated in the hands of elites. Taxes rose. Trade restrictions imposed by European empires frustrated merchants who wanted freedom to buy and sell without oversight. Britain enforced its navigation acts. Spain restricted trade to approved ports. France controlled who could buy or sell sugar. These policies enriched Europe but created tension in the colonies, where people began to question why their wealth was controlled by a distant crown. The prosperity of the 18th century was not peaceful. It fueled conflict. Enslaved Africans rebelled against the unbearable conditions of plantation life. Indigenous nations resisted colonial expansion when settlers threatened their lands. Poor farmers rioted against unfair taxes. Merchants protested against restrictive trade laws. Beneath the surface of economic growth, rebellion simmered, and then came the global shock that changed everything. The 7 Years' War. The war's cost forced Britain, France, and Spain to impose new taxes and laws on their colonies in a desperate attempt to recover losses. These decisions deepened resentment, especially in the British colonies, where settlers saw taxation without representation as an insult to their rights. The colonies had matured. They no longer saw themselves as mere extensions of European empires. They saw themselves as societies with their own identity, their own interests, and their own future. The rigid hierarchies and economic systems that once defined the Americas began to weaken under the pressure of Enlightenment, ideas, freedom, equality, and national self-determination. By the end of the 18th century, the colonial economies that had once strengthened empires were now fueling discontent. The social hierarchies built to maintain control were cracking. Revolutions brewed in the minds of merchants, intellectuals, indigenous leaders, enslaved communities, and criollos. The world that European empires had built was becoming too heavy to hold. The stage was set for uprisings that would shake the Americas and the world to its core. By the late 18th century, the Americas stood on the edge of transformation. For centuries, European empires had controlled the continent through force, trade, religion, and rigid social hierarchies. But now, new ideas were spreading across the Atlantic, carried by books, merchants, soldiers, and whispered conversations in taverns and marketplaces. The world was changing, and the colonies felt it deeply. The seeds of revolution, small at first, almost invisible, were beginning to grow. The Enlightenment, a movement born in Europe, reached the Americas like a spark touching dry grass. Philosophers challenged old systems and questioned the divine right of kings. Ideas of liberty, equality, self-rule, and human rights began to circulate. Colonists debated concepts that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. Why should distant kings control their lives? Why should taxes be imposed without representation? Why should one race or class have power over another? The Enlightenment gave the colonies language for their frustrations and a vision for a different future. In the British colonies, discontent grew rapidly. After the costly 7 Years' War, the British government turned to the colonies for revenue. New taxes on paper, tea, sugar, and everyday goods angered merchants and farmers alike. While the taxes themselves were small, the principle behind them sparked outrage. Britain was trying to rule the colonies without giving them a voice. Protests erupted across Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. People gathered in streets, formed committees, and began to see themselves, not as subjects, but as citizens with rights worth defending. As the British cracked down on dissent, colonial unity strengthened. Newspapers spread revolutionary ideas. Writers and speakers stirred public passion. Meetings grew louder and more defiant. The colonies were awakening, and the empire felt control slipping away. By the end of the century, these tensions would ignite a full-scale revolution that would change the world. In the Spanish Americas, a different kind of unrest simmered. Criollos, American-born Spaniards, grew increasingly frustrated with their second-class status. They were wealthy, educated, and embedded in colonial society. Yet they were barred from the highest political positions, all reserved for peninsulares, born in Spain. This inequality fueled resentment that grew year after year. Criollos began reading Enlightenment texts and questioning why Spain had the right to rule them from afar. Indigenous communities, long oppressed under Spanish rule, found new opportunities for resistance. They protested forced labor, resisted increased taxation, and joined local uprisings. Their struggle was not driven by Enlightenment ideals, but by centuries of exploitation and injustice. Revolts like the Great Tupac Amaru II uprising shook the Andes and revealed the cracks in Spanish authority. In Brazil, enslaved Africans formed the heart of resistance. They built secret networks, ran away to form free maroon settlements, and fought against the brutal plantation system. Their resistance was not simply rebellion, it was an assertion of humanity in the face of a system designed to erase their identity. Rumblings of change spread throughout Brazil as cities grew, trade expanded, and a new Brazilian identity slowly emerged. In the Caribbean, the pressure reached its breaking point. Saint Domingue, France's richest colony, became the center of explosive tension. The island's society was divided into strict racial and economic classes: wealthy whites, poorer whites, free people of color, and enslaved Africans who outnumbered them all. The brutality of the plantation system created anger that simmered beneath the surface. As Enlightenment ideas reached the colony, and France itself faced a revolution, Saint Domingue prepared to erupt into a rebellion so powerful it would reshape the entire Atlantic world. Meanwhile, Spain's Bourbon reforms further inflamed colonial anger. Increased taxes, tighter trade controls, and new restrictions on local power convinced many criollos that Spain cared only about extracting wealth, not about the well-being of its colonies. Tensions grew into quiet movements, secret meetings, and early attempts at self-governance. The Spanish Empire was no longer unbreakable. Across the continent, African, indigenous, and mixed communities formed the backbone of resistance. Some resisted quietly by preserving languages, traditions, and cultural practices that colonial authorities tried to erase. Others fought openly, joining rebellions or organizing revolts. In every colony, whether Spanish, British, French, or Portuguese, oppressed people contributed to the revolutionary spirit rising across the Americas. Even seemingly small events created ripples that would later become waves. Smugglers defied trade laws and built economic independence. Local militias trained themselves for potential conflict. Leaders emerged from unexpected places: merchants, farmers, priests, and even former slaves, each inspired by the idea that freedom was possible. By the 1770s and 1780s, the atmosphere across the Americas felt electric. Tension was everywhere. Colonies that had once felt distant from one another now shared a common experience: dissatisfaction with imperial rule. The people of the Americas, diverse in culture, class, and race, began asking the same question in different ways. Why should decisions about our lives be made in capitals across the ocean? When the American Revolution broke out in 1775, its shockwaves spread through the hemisphere. Spain watched with caution. France saw an opportunity for revenge against Britain. Enslaved Africans in the Caribbean saw hope. Criollos in South America saw a model for independence. Indigenous nations saw yet another shift in colonial power that threatened their lands. The world was changing, and the Americas were poised to follow that change wherever it led. The seeds of revolution were no longer seeds. They had taken root, grown, and begun to crack the foundations of centuries-old empires. The 18th century, which began as a story of imperial expansion, was ending as a story of resistance, awakening, and the unstoppable rise of new identities seeking freedom. As the final decades of the 18th century unfolded, the Americas stood at a dramatic crossroads. For more than 200 years, European empires had ruled the continent with power, confidence, and ambition. They built colonies, extracted wealth, imposed laws, reshaped societies, and forced millions of people, indigenous, African, and mixed, into systems designed to benefit distant kings. But now, the world they created was beginning to crack. The old order, once solid and unquestioned, was breaking under the weight of its own contradictions. Across North America, the British colonies had transformed into prosperous societies with bustling cities, deep intellectual life, and growing political consciousness. For decades, colonists saw themselves as loyal subjects of the crown, but the 7 Years' War changed everything. Britain's attempt to recover war debts by taxing the colonies sparked fierce anger. People who had once defended the empire now questioned why a distant king should control their lives. Protests grew louder, pamphlets spread revolutionary ideas, and local militias prepared for conflict. The American Revolution was not just a rebellion, it was the first tremor of a much larger earthquake. When independence was declared in 1776, the shock traveled far beyond the 13 colonies. The idea that ordinary people could overthrow a European empire challenged centuries of tradition. It inspired hope among the oppressed and fear among the rulers. The success of the American Revolution forced the world to confront a dangerous question. If Britain's colonies could break free, why not others? Spain watched nervously. Its empire stretched across Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean territories, far larger than Britain's former colonies. But Spain's grip was weakening. Criollos, long excluded from high office, began to dream of a world ruled by people born in the Americas, not Europeans. Indigenous communities continued to resist Spanish control, while enslaved Africans in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Venezuela endured harsh conditions that sparked constant unrest. The Bourbon reforms, intended to strengthen Spain's rule, only deepened resentment. Revolts simmered beneath the surface. In the Caribbean, the greatest colonial explosion of the century was about to erupt. In Saint-Domingue, the richest colony on Earth, hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans lived under a brutal plantation system that pushed them past the limits of human endurance. The society was a powder keg, rigid, violent, unequal. When the ideas of liberty and equality reached the island, they ignited a revolution unlike anything the world had ever seen. Enslaved men and women rose up, fought their oppressors, and built the first free black republic in history, Haiti. Their victory sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, striking fear into every slaveholding nation and inspiring enslaved people everywhere. Meanwhile, in South America, new leaders emerged: priests, lawyers, military officers, and intellectuals who read Enlightenment ideas and dreamed of independence. Though their revolutions would not begin until the early 19th century, the foundations were laid in the 18th century through discontent, secret societies, and rising Criollo nationalism. People like Francisco de Miranda traveled the world learning revolutionary ideas, preparing to bring change to their homelands. In Brazil, Portuguese power appeared strong on the surface, but beneath it, a new Brazilian identity was forming. Gold rush towns like Minas Gerais produced wealth that enriched Portugal, yet also empowered local elites who resented Portuguese taxes and monopolies. Small uprisings, such as the Minas Conspiracy, hinted at a growing desire for freedom. Enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, and mixed communities resisted domination through rebellion, cultural preservation, and the creation of independent settlements. The indigenous nations of North America faced an uncertain future. After the 7 Years' War, Britain restricted colonial expansion to protect indigenous lands, but settlers ignored the law. Tensions rose as more Europeans moved westward, pushing tribes into conflict. When the American Revolution broke out, indigenous nations were forced to choose sides, knowing that any outcome threatened their survival. The end of the century left them vulnerable, facing powerful new nations that sought control of their land. The global economy that had enriched Europe also began to shift. Industrialization in Britain changed the way goods were produced, creating new economic demands that strained colonial relationships. Europe's desire for raw materials and new markets increased pressure on the colonies, deepening frustration in the Americas. By the 1790s, revolutions shook the world. The French Revolution destroyed the old monarchy and spread ideas of liberty and equality throughout Europe and the Atlantic. Its effects rippled into the American continent, inspiring reformers, terrifying colonial governors, and fueling new demands for independence. The world was entering a new age, an age of revolution, nationalism, and self-determination. As the 18th century came to an end, the Americas no longer looked like a continent ruled by uncontested European power. Instead, it had become a continent alive with resistance, ambition, and the desire for freedom. Empires weakened. Colonies matured. People of every background, indigenous, African, European, and mixed, began shaping their own destinies. The old colonial order was crumbling. A new world was on the horizon, and the revolutions that would soon sweep across the Americas were already growing in the hearts and minds of the people who had endured centuries of domination. The century that began with empire would end with rebellion. The Americas were ready to change forever.